It's really our pleasure to welcome Joe Booth, an incredible guy, a remarkable story. He'll talk about his dyslexia story, but also talk about how he got into game design in his teen years and ended up working for, a lot of different companies and a lot of different games, all the different genres, and how now he's got the startup company with Video Gamer that involves crowded fiction. So it's our pleasure, Joe.
Thank you. So, okay, everyone. Well, it's been firstly it's an honor to be part of this and to to have met Burnett and Brooke and and it was really fun putting this together. So I made me go back and think about my childhood and how I got into this. So this is kind of what I'm trying to cover today. So it's, I guess, like 4 areas. So I want to talk about my childhood and what it was like being dyslexic and how I became a game maker, and kind of whisk through my 20 plus years of game making. I'll talk about what we're doing now, and at the end of it, what I'd like to do is for us to answer questions, because I know some of you are interested in doing that, and seeing how we can, how can we work as a community and how can I help? Because as you'll see, being part of the community was very important to me as I was, as I was kind of following my passion. So this is a slide here. This just is kind of like a one-pager of my video game career. So, and this is over 25 plus years, right? So over 30 titles, 24 million in sales, 1 billion in revenue, 10 ICES and BAFTA nominations. So they're kind of like the BAFTA and what do you call them? The Oscars of video games. And then I've worked on lots of different types of games, right? So online, I was an early pioneer in online social play. I've worked with sports games, shooters, platform, driving, simulation, kids. And I've worked in lots of different roles. So I started off as I started off doing everything, but kind of as an engineer. And I've done production, I've done design and direction. So I can do that. So, so part 1, childhood. So this is my family. I am the youngest of 4, and my older sister, who you can see here with her dog, she was diagnosed as being dyslexic. I guess I was like 5 or 6 at the time, and so they thought to test me. I want to say I was 9 or 10, and so I was diagnosed with being dyslexic pretty young. And I don't know. I on the one hand, people I was always a happy child, but I found things very confusing. I was good at some things at school, but I struggled at others, and I found it hard to predict what I would be good at. And I think that despite the dyslexic instruction that we had there, I don't think it was very good, to be honest. And the teachers didn't have training, and so even if I had some instruction, it wasn't very engaging. And but there was one thing that I was fascinated about, and that was computers. And I wrote it down. This is in 1982. I was 12 years old, and this was my first computer. It's called a Sinclair Spectrum, and it was a huge deal. This was like, I think it only came out in the UK and Europe, but it was a huge deal because it had color graphics and it had this rubber keyboard, and they did a cheaper version that was £99, which was a big deal. And I just begged my parents and somehow negotiated with them that I would, they would buy this for me, but I would have to pay back some of it through doing my paper round. But this was just a life changer for me, and I got it Christmas Day, and back then we only had one TV, and you had to plug it into the TV, and even so, it's the UK, so they have the Queen's Speech and the James Bond movie, so I wasn't able to use my computer, but I was still able to program it even without a screen. I had it beeping and bopping and stuff. And I was off with my computers, and to begin with, you start off with this language called BASIC, and it's very simple. And you say print hello, and it says hello, and you do this little for loop, and it says hello 100 times. And and I would do things where you type in things from the magazines, and I remember, like, I would just call up, like, someone who was my favorite game maker. I would figure out what company they worked for, and I would find the number, and I'd say, hey, can I speak to so-and-so, and say, how do you do this? How do you get into games? And just became totally obsessed with this. And pretty soon I graduated to this Commodore 64, which some of the parents might remember. This was, I guess, a big deal. It was always between Commodore and Atari, and that was kind of, when I was young, that they were the Sony and the Xbox of the day. And they had like a real keyboard, and you could get a disk drive for it. And I found that this community around the Commodore 64, and I would go to computer clubs, and it was a big deal. Like, you couldn't get these titles from America. Things like, there's a game here, Seven Cities of Gold, and the only way you could get that was by going to these computer clubs, and there was this kind of these guys that hacked into the games and broke the copy protection, and it became a big part of my life, and they accepted me, and I could talk their language, and it began to be the thing that I focused on. And in my mind, like, to make video games was the equivalent to being a rock star. So like, in my mind, like, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to make video games, and I never thought I would be able to make video games. I thought, like, only the best of the best programmers or artists would be able to make video games, and the rest of them would have to make word processors or whatever. And so that was, that took me on this journey, and I think it really saved me as a child, because it gave me somewhere where I was an expert, and it allowed me to kind of pick up complex language and gave me currency and stuff. So it became a big part of my life. And then, BASIC can only take you so far. I remember on my Spectrum, like, Spectrum didn't have hardware sprites, but you could do software sprites. And, I had this program that did it in BASIC, and it would take half an hour, like, to literally plot everything pixel by pixel. So the thing you needed to master if you wanted to make games was this thing called machine code, which to me, as a 12 or 13-year-old, was like this dark magic of the computers. And I was trying to figure out what it was, and I would use the metaphor of my paper round, right? So it turns out this is what we call a monitor, right? And this is giving you the raw details of memory, right? And it turns out, computers, basically, they just have addresses, which is, that has data in them. And you think about a screen, it hasn't really changed, right? Because back then you'd have, you change number in the screen, it would change character. So each one of these is a different number, a certain number is R, a certain number is E. So I was able to visualize, well, this is kind of like being on my paper round, and each house is an address, and each newspaper I put in is a different number, right? And this metaphor really helped me understand it, and then the way I kind of taught myself to code was very visually. So I would do things that were like, I've made the screen change, or I put a sprite on the screen. And then it's like, and what's the next thing I could do with that? Or even before that, I would go through and I would find text in a game, and I would modify the text and make my kind of very rudimentary modified versions of games. Go to the next thing. So, I continued to do this, and I kind of got better and better, and I wrote these machine code things and these demos, and I was able to make the computer do things that it wasn't supposed to do, and I was able to do things that appeared very flashy. And I was like, I guess I was 14 at this point, and I would send it off to all these companies, and one of them offered me a contract, and they said, hey, we'll give you £4,000 to take this arcade game called the Calorie Warriors and put it on the Commodore 64. And I was like, that's fantastic. They gave me £1,000 up front. And I really didn't know what I was doing. I had done these flashy demos, and I didn't really know that I didn't know what I was doing. And so I had to go and learn all these different things. And so I was very slow. At the same time, I was supposed to be at school, but but I thought I don't want to do school. I'm not really doing anything there. I was spending more and more time at home doing computers, and so I went to the school and said, hey, I want to make video games, and leave school. And they said, you can't do that, because I was, I think, what, 15 by then. And they said, you have to stay to a certain point by law, and that's the law. So what I ended up doing is just kind of skipping school for most of that year, and I'm working on this game. But because I was slow, I ended up getting fired. But I'd learned enough through that I managed to get another job at this local company called Cascade. And so this was my first game. It was called Implosion. And I think I was 16 when this was launched, and it sold, I think, 10,000 units. And I think it only came out in England and maybe Europe. And I was like, well, hey, I'm making video games, and my friends, they're stuck at school, and this is this new life for me. But I guess it wasn't something that was easy, right? I had that. Oh, there's something else I forgot to say. So part of what the school did is they sent me to a technical college, like a computer engineering college, and they did all these tests on me. In terms of, it was all these aptitude tests, and I don't have the same brain that they typically see in a computer programmer. So these guys said, well, we're not going to take you, so because you are not what we see as a traditional coder, and we see that you're doing these things, and we think that's great, but you're probably just able to do them because you're interested in them, which is the most retarded thing I've ever heard, I think. But but that kind of sat with me. So I had these knockbacks, but at the same time, I was 16. I had made my first game, and I was off in this new world. So we're going to go fast through a lot of years. So this is the 8-bit era. So this is my late teens, early 20s, and it was the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo. Those were the consoles, and I did a lot of like platform games and licensed games around these things. And this is me really cutting my teeth, right? And so I was churning out quite a lot of games, and they were kind of reasonably successful. Some of these, I think the Addams Family game there did something like 2 million units or something, although they screwed us out with the royalties. But that's kind of what it was like back then. But it was great. I was very happy to be doing what I wanted to do. But the industry was about to change, right? So it had always been 8-bit, 16-bit. It was very small teams. And it would be me. It would be an artist. We'd hire a musician for a couple of weeks. Maybe we started to have a designer or something, but it was teams of a handful of people, and it was still all in this machine code. So kind of in my mid-20s, then things started to change, as I say. So high-level languages started to come in, and so I needed to learn C, and C was, I didn't know, well, I wasn't very good at going through the books, and I found that a hard way to learn. And so the way I'd learn C, this high-level language, is that I would write things out 3 or 4 times, and I would have it compile it, and then I would look at the compiler making that into machine code, and I would figure out which one was doing the thing that I wanted to do. And I was like, okay, that's the right way to do it. And it's a very slow way of doing it, but it was kind of the way I was able to figure it out with my dyslexia. The other thing I did in my mid-20s is that I decided I wanted to read, right? I was like, this isn't right. I can do these great things in video games, but I can't read a book. And so I went off to the library. I went to the children's section. I started with Winnie the Pooh and Alice in Wonderland and books like that. And I literally kind of taught myself to read, and it was very slow to begin with, but I just got this practice of reading these books. And a friend of mine, Carl, he gave me, I think it was his book by John Irving, by Trevor Omini, but there was a character in this book whose friend was dyslexic, and the character, he gave his friend a piece of paper so that you could do that thing where you hold the paper underneath the words. And I tried it. I read that, and I went got a piece of paper and I tried it, and it was like bingo. Like all of a sudden my eyes settled, and I could read at a decent speed. And I think that was the first kind of grown-up book that I ever read. And since then, I have been able to read at a decent rate. My wife says that I read faster than her, and I don't need the paper anymore. But that was very important. It kind of trained me in some way to be able to do that. I kind of skipping a big chunk of my career here. Did you want to ask me something?
Just briefly, if that's okay. There were some kids who were really interested in what things were like for you in school. Henry asked whether, like, maybe the teacher didn't like you or anything like that. Some of the kids were asking about whether you got in trouble. I think they're just trying to get it in perspective with the way they might be seeing school now.
Yeah, I think I wasn't someone who played up. I know that happens with some kids. I felt stupid. I would say, and my handwriting was bad anyway, but I would make it worse because I was scared of like the bad writing and being called out on that. And so I remember for the most part the teachers were not really accommodating or able to accommodate me and my dyslexia. Except for there was a couple that did inspire me. Actually, I do remember there was one teacher when I was super young, like I was 6 or something like that, and I think I was just freaked out by school, and I came out in my voice, right? I couldn't say my R's, and this teacher was very nasty to me. I remember, like I vaguely remember, but like I remember my sister kind of screaming at this teacher and stuff, and this being a big thing, and then crying at home trying to say my R's because this teacher was making a big deal out of it. And then there was a couple of teachers that I did find it inspiring. We had a physics teacher. It's funny because most of the kids hated him because he would take no nonsense. And this is back in the 80s where, you probably couldn't still throw things at kids, but he did. They would have the rubber, and if someone was talking, they would kind of literally throw the rubber at them. And sorry, rubber is a big eraser thing. I just remembered I'm in America. And so he wouldn't take any rubbish from the kids, but he was like doing all this cool engineering stuff. So we would do microprocessors and things that I guess there was no way that was part of the curriculum, but it was something that I was like, hey, this is good. And I remember he left this kind of at the end of the year before I kind of disengaged. And I think it's a shame, right? And I think what the downside of that was that, I didn't explore some of the creative sides. Like I think I would have liked to explore, writing and creative writing. I think that would have been a good option for me. So I'm just seeing, so someone asked, so your family was supportive and allowed you to follow your passion. What about reading and writing? So, I think my parents really didn't know what to do. I think there was a general thing about, hey, computers are good and computers are the future, but people didn't necessarily understand them. So there was this thing, well, of all the things that my son could be doing, this is probably not a bad thing. But I imagine, like, they were quite confused because I would just disappear. I'd be like 14, 15, and I would be going off from our small town into the big cities and hanging out with these much older people and stuff. Shall I carry on? Because we can come back and we could do lots of questions later. I'll carry on. I want to talk about this phase of my life. So I did the early 8-bit and then going into the 16-bit and learning learning C, like high-level languages. The other thing that changed was that teams got bigger, right? And so there was a lot of skills about like how do we work with other people. And I kind of shifted away from coding. I found that coding was becoming about software engineering, and I was passionate about the games, and I wanted to be about that. So before Ubisoft, I was with a startup for 5 years, and that brought me lots of experience around the publishing side, and we were doing a ton of products at once and stuff. And so that was interesting, and I guess I went to Ubisoft and I began to ask a different question. I felt before that I was asking, how do you make games? What is it you need to do? How do you do that better than someone else? And I got to a point where I was asking the why questions, like, well, why should we do this, or why does that work, or how do you do less but it means more? And Ubisoft was a great culture to be asking those questions in, because the only company that I've seen that really studies that, and that they had all this database of research they've done over the years, or articles that people had written internally in white papers. It really opened my mind, and then I began to kind of study filmmaking and script writing, and there's a book here called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is about the hero myth, and it was something that Spielberg and George Lucas talked a lot about for Star Wars and Jaws, and then there's a book here about story, which is really about script writing. I became very interested in this kind of different craft area, and really thinking about how do we control the emotion of the game, and how does the meaning, the meaning of a story, how does that affect the emotional arc? And I'll put this into context in terms of shooting games with something like Ghost Recon. So, if you think about war, things around war, really the core values at stake is usually around liberty, right? So you have someone being oppressed, or you have some, sort of fighting for their freedom, and then you have these emotions really about the extremes of the emotions are around power versus panic. So if you use this approach in terms of game making, then you're trying to think about your levels in terms of, okay, well, where do we want to be on that spectrum? Do we want this level to be about making the player feel powerful, or do we want this to be making them feel in panic, right? And then what are our means to do this? So in a shooting game, if you want to make the player feel powerful, then you give them, a very powerful weapon that has a lot of ammunition, that doesn't take long to reload. You put them in a level design where they're protected from behind, and they've got height advantage over their foe. You have, the non-play characters, you would have them speaking in a calm voice and in control, and you'd have all these means of expressing this emotion that you wanted to do. And the flip of that, if you wanted to do panic, then you would put the player in a situation where, perhaps the cover gets deteriorated, it gets shot, the gun that they've got has limited ammo, or maybe it jams, or maybe it takes a long time to reload. The non-player characters are screaming, they're shouting at you. And it's this new way that I found to look about games, and I found this very powerful. So the next chapter in my career was going to EA, and I didn't intend to go to EA. I came to Vancouver, and I was actually interviewing at a different company there, and I began to see how this methodology could be applied to FIFA. And then, they were talking about where FIFA was and the problems at that time. FIFA was losing market share to Pro Evolution Soccer, and actually lost significant market share. So they were kind of at a loss. And I began to see how this method could be applied. So I went there, and we started to apply some of these things. And if a shooter is about power versus panic, a sports game is about glory versus shame, right? So, when you're, 3-0 up, you feel a sense of glory, and when you're, 2-0 down or 5-0 down, you feel this extreme shame, right? And so we built that into the systems, and, this kind of emotional approach, I took it for the whole product, right? You think about the online play in FIFA that's become so important. It used to be that you would only play one player versus another player with online. And I changed all that. I said, it's important that team play makes a difference, because emotionally, when you play as part of the team, you can lose, but you can still add value. You can still have a meaning for that game that you've just had. And we also looked at how we tie the online play into the real world of football, and we did these things around connecting the game more closely to the current season, and that really inspired a lot of where FIFA's gone. So the other thing I was doing there was it was kind of honing my skills as a leader, right? And I learned that I really enjoyed growing people and finding talent, and I was very fortunate on FIFA that I had, my first year there, I had what became two of the big stars of FIFA, a guy called Gary Patterson, who was a creative director for many years, a guy called Paul Hossack, who now does the FIFA Ultimate Team stuff for them now. and I just found out I had a talent for doing, for getting the best out of people, and that was rewarding. The other side, though, is I learned that I struggle in bigger companies, and I found this a bit at Ubisoft, but also at EA, where I'm a very literal person, and when someone says they're going to do something, then I just think they're going to do it. I don't necessarily think, oh, what's their other agendas? And I found in bigger companies that that's harder for me to navigate. But I learned some other things as well, right? I think, like, I've always been about the product, and I've always thought, like, we need to have everyone on the team in the product. But I learned at EA that you can have people with different motivations in a team, and it's good to have people who balance out your skills. So let me go on to the next thing. And so after EA, I came to Microsoft, and I started at Microsoft. I was the executive producer on a game called Rise, which is an Xbox One launch title. And I wasn't really enjoying that. Again, I found this bigger company. It was the group I was in felt political, and it wasn't about the content. So I was kind of looking around for something else in the company, and this was just after Kinect was launched, and there was this initiative to say, hey, can we get Xbox into more hands? And so they had this initiative to do kids games, and part of the mantra of that was like, well, let's do games that have some good for you content, right, or good to you aspect to that. And I thought that was a great idea, and I joined that group, and we took over this project, Microsoft Kodu, and I was blown away. Like, that Microsoft Kodu was a research project, and the idea was like, well, how can we get? I think this was before the iPads. It was started before the iPad really took off, and I think it's become easier in the last 5 years. But this was guys in Microsoft Research who were, starting to have kids, and they were thinking, well, how are kids going to get into coding? Because when we were young, we went into BASIC or we went into DOS, and we would just, it was much easier to fiddle around. So the idea with Kodu was to use kids' passion for games to introduce them to concepts, but not be about the syntax. And it's funny, like, I looked at it as a game designer, and I was like, well, this is full of holes, right? There's lots of areas where people would get stuck. But in a classroom setting, it was amazing because that actually worked to its advantage. And, what would happen when we, went to observe it in a classroom was that when someone got stuck, the teacher didn't know what to do. And it often turned out that the kid that really got it was the kid who struggled in other parts of the school, other parts of the learning. And this person would have currency now, and they would be the one that was going to fix it and was showing the teacher what to do, and it helped their esteem. And I was like, wow, this reminds me of my youth, and it reminds me of how I learned, and I just thought that was brilliant. And then at the same time, I have kids, and they were just starting school, and I was like, wow, schools are really messed up, and learning about this idea that games can help with education. Felt like, wow, it felt like the same thing when I learned about video games, and I was like, wow, this is something I want to do. So Microsoft changed focus, and that group kind of got faded out, and the options for me, do I go back and do core games and innovate and killing people and do what I've been doing for many years, or do I follow this new passion? So I chose to do that, and I left Microsoft a little bit over a year ago. And that leads us to part 3. So I call this Joe Booth 2.0. And, I think if you think back to how I started and talked about this passion I had for video games, I had a clear kind of vision of what I wanted to do. I wanted to make video games. It's very simple, and it didn't necessarily matter where I made a shooter game or a platform game. It was something that I wanted to do that was in that space and grow their experience in that space. So I think it's important to life to understand what your goals are and to communicate that well, because, it doesn't necessarily, the next step you make may kind of take you sideways a little bit, but as long as you're always working towards that big goal and communicating that, then people will say, hey, well, have you thought about this? I love that. Someone said, I love Roller Coaster Tycoon and have been asking it for Christmas forever. I think it's, just to digress, I think Roller Coaster Tycoon is on the iPad now. I think I saw that. And that is actually the highest selling game that I've ever worked on. It sold a staggering like 10 million copies on PC. So it actually sold more than the FIFAs I worked on. And it's made by this guy in Scotland who lives in a tiny village, and he just makes the games that he wants to make for himself. And his game before that was very moderately successful, and his game after that was very moderately successful. And he doesn't care; he just made the game he wanted to make. Sorry, I digress then. So, let me get to my notes. So, when I left Microsoft and I started to look at these games and learning space, I assumed I would probably do something around programming like Odoo-esque, or I would do something that was skill-based. So most people think about games as being, hey, games can teach us math, or games can teach us these physics skills. But there was a problem with that, and a problem with a lot of way people think about games and learning it. And I would do these consulting jobs, and I did some things with the Gates Foundation, Pearson Foundation, and Achieve 3000. And they would come with these great ideas, and it was, wouldn't it be great if we made Zelda, and but it had these learning goals about it. And I found I was just talking myself out of work, because I would say, well, Zelda costs, I don't know, maybe $10 million, right? And you have maybe $100,000, right? And you've never made a Zelda before, and you want to make it more complicated than Zelda because you want to add all this other stuff. And the kids are going to know, right? They're going to know that this is a bad Zelda. So you can make a really bad Zelda for $100,000, or you can do something a bit more strategic or something. So I found like people were looking at games and learning it, and making things that are probably bad games and bad at learning for the most part. But something in the research as I did, it kept coming back to this idea around background knowledge, right? So there's a lot of research, and this book here, kind of talks about the research, right? But there's a lot of research around what gives kids an edge in class. And it turns out, if a child believes he's going to be successful in a class, then is more likely to be successful. So what makes a child believe they're going to be more successful? Well, it turns out if you've been pre-exposed to something, then you are more likely to believe you're going to be successful. So how does a child be pre-exposed to it? And it turns out that children of upper and middle class means have much more ability to be pre-exposed, right? They'll go on more exotic holidays, or they'll go to museums, which are the best things, but or they'll get access to books. So I began to think about entertainment as being a means for exposing kids to background knowledge, and I'm thinking that this is a much more a much more credible way to use entertainment. And I think the shameful thing about video games is that there's actually some titles that do this amazingly well. Like if you want to learn about Europe and the Renaissance, go play Assassin's Creed 2, right? Like it does it so well. If you want to learn about the Wild West, go play Red Dead Redemption, right? And so the thing is, these are M-rated games. These are things that game makers we make for ourselves, right? And we do this amazing job with background knowledge, and people research it and be very passionate about it. But the things we're making for our kids, the choices that we make as an industry tend to be very bad, right? So you think about Mario and Zelda, those are great games, but they have no background knowledge. It's a complete lost opportunity. My kids are hugely into Skylanders right now, which again is abstract. It's a wasted opportunity with background knowledge. So I think, there's just across all entertainment, we can make some simple choices that could be very impactful for kids. So, as I began, well, let me go back before I do that. So as I began to think, like, what can I really focus on with my means? I can afford to fund a little bit, but I can't build a studio, and I know how much it costs to make a really great game, and I know how long it takes. But I thought, I could do something around literacy, and I began to think about, well, now that we're reading iPads, how do we use them to do, how does that media change? And if you think about interactivity in reading, it's an old idea, right? We've had things in the 80s. We had Choose Your Own Adventures is still around today, right? Which is kind of interactive reading, but the hardware sucks. On paper is you print it once, it doesn't change, right? And then we had like on the Apple, we had things like these text-based adventures, and well, the hardware can be adaptive, but reading never took off on these devices. Like people tried to do ebooks on PCs, but for the most part, people don't read on their PC or their TV. But with the tablets, everything's changed, right? Now we read on our tablets, and now I think we can begin to think, well, what could interactive mean on these devices? So, our vision for crowded fiction is to use this game making stuff to inspire the next generation of kids to love reading as much as this generation loves video games. And you may not know what a BHAG is. So there's a BHAG is this concept of for a company is to have a big, hairy, audacious goal, right? So what is it that you're shooting for that you're always comparing yourself against, or you can make sure that all your partners line up against? So for Microsoft, Bill Gates had this vision of a computer on every desk and in every home. And at the time, that was audacious, right? People thought he was crazy. But that's something that he delivered on over 10, 20 years. So it's important for companies to have that. And what it helps for me is like, I can look at my product today, we've just done V1, and it's like, hey, we've done some great things, but we've still got a long way to go to hit this big goal. So this is crowded fiction. This is so crowded fiction is it's an ebook platform, but we've just got one book, right? Because we have to build everything from scratch. So we've just launched, and we used Kickstarter to help fund the book, although we funded the app ourselves. And the idea is it's interactive fiction. You see here we have the guy holding the iPad, and we thought, well, let's just focus on text and using the iPad input to do text. So here there's kind of like a driving scene where you're kind of driving in a book, which is kind of crazy. So, and it has a number of pillars, right? So the first one is interactive, right? So, as you're reading, you will throw the punches, you'll steer through the chase scenes. You can control the pace, which I think is a big thing. So if you want to just go straight through a scene, you can just do that. But if you want to stop and examine everything, and look at all the subplots, you can do that too. And then we started to kind of play around with the conversation system, right? Turned out we have to, in that, to do that successfully, you have to be able to read the body language of the person that you're in a conversation with. On the social side, so what we wanted to do there is to, tie in a social currency, and we've just, done this in a subtle way, but because each chapter has a major choice that the reader has to make, then we found people were really interested in what their friends did. So we gave the ability to do that, and it will pop up and say your friend has just changed their choice to this or whatever. And a competitive angle as well, right? So we added these Xbox Live style achievements because we know that for some people are really motivated by like ticking off every box, right? Getting every achievement or doing one better than their friend, going through and do that. So we're trying to use these different levels of these different motivation structures of video games into a book. And then this idea of crowded, right? And this is kind of works on multiple levels. So as I said, we use Kickstarter to fund part of the project. And then through that, what we did is we gave away, we said, hey, if you give us $1,000, you can be a co-star in the book. And if you give us $100, you can be what we call a red shirt. And a red shirt was a character you find dead. And so what we found is like, we thought that was a great idea, and it was really easy to say that. And then we had all these people write these things for us. It's like, wow, we've got to figure that into the story. And it made the story kind of shift and take it on its own direction. And so it was a really fascinating experience. And then the third thing that we decided is like, well, how do we take that to the next level? And so each chapter in the book has a dilemma, and we thought, well, let's let the crowd decide the outcome of that dilemma and have that impact the next book. So I'll give you an example. in the first chapter, you come across a dead body. And this dead body is, you find $100 on the dead body, and you can choose whether you're going to take that or not. And you're by yourself, and no one's going to see whether you take that. But the idea is that's going to affect the character, right? And gives you that feedback. And depending on what the crowd does, then that will write that into the character of Jackson in the next book. And so, right now, 60% of the crowd has taken the money. And it's funny because, like, if I do a little update and say, hey, 60% guys, what are you doing? And then people will go back and reread it and change it. So it was a way for people to feel invested in the story going forward. So, as I said, so we have just got the first version of Crowded Fiction out. I feel very protective over this. I feel like, we have these goals of doing something that is really good around reading. So, we have a plan that we can do this very slowly, but we need help. And I always say this: we need to be upfront in terms of saying, like, we need the right funding partner. And I've spoken to angels and VCs here, and it's like, these people will be great when we want to get to scale, but I'm looking for someone who I can look in the eye and think, you really get that BHAG. Right, and you're going to be with us, and you're going to be with us to make the right choices when things get hard. And then I think we've got to decide a couple of things. I would love to do something that was closer to academic, or I don't know if it's a dyslexic. If we do something better for dyslexic kids, and we're doing a test right now. But do we go that way more, or do we go more into the entertainment? So. So that's where we are with Crowded Fiction. How are we doing for time? So, yes, so now I have time for the Q&A. And I'm sorry, because I haven't been reading the stuff as it's been going up and down, because I didn't find I could do that. But I had a couple of things for the Q&A, and then we'll open it up. So I thought, the number one thing I want to share people, so I know people are here that want to make video games. My role as a leader on a game like FIFA is really to, you get to a point where you don't write code anymore, you don't, do the design documents anymore, and it's really your job to push other people. And, there's courses and there's lots of things that we can find for people, but you need to be making stuff, right? And you need to be going on this journey, the same journey that I went on, from playing games to modding games, like tinkering with games and creating your own, and that's how you'll be successful. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then to ask, generally, what are people interested in? Are you interested in being an engineer, or doing the art, the modeling, the animation, level design, game design? And then the third thing is, like, what should we do moving forward, right? So we have people on that are interested in doing game design. A community was very important for me when I was a child. There's lots of research around that. There's a guy called Jim G who talks about this, about what the positive side of games are. So those are the things, like, what is it that you want to do? What's stopping you now, and how can I help?
I have a question. I think this was back a ways, Joe.
Yeah.
For kids starting out, are there particular languages, or do you know any? What's a good way to start if someone knows absolutely nothing? Maybe knows how to do a little HTML, which is the common thing, but would love to get into games. Do you have any advice about this?
Yeah, I think, I think we're in a great time for those early tools. And there's a bunch of things out there. So one of the first things people can look at is Scratch from MIT. There's Kodu from Microsoft. And these are things that we have, like, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds doing. And one part, like, I had my wife make a game with Kodu. That's how accessible it is. And then there's a bunch of things around that. There's things like Game Maker, Game Salad. These are interesting because you can make apps with them as well, and it's pretty cheap to do that. So someone's saying about Code Academy. So Code Academy is cool. It's not based around games, or at least I don't believe they have a game thing. But Code Academy was trying to gamify, like make a game out of learning to code, which I don't know how successful it is.
How can parents, I guess the concern is that kids will go out and just play the games rather than really learn something from the games. It could just be a time sucker. Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, I don't know that I've solved that. So as a parent, I live that. You know, and it's a weird thing. I think you have to be on top of your kids. You have to push your kids. So even Minecraft, Minecraft to begin with teaches a ton of skills, right? You know, I used it on my son when he was from about 6, I guess, and it was great because he was learning all these digital media skills, media literacy skills, like you have to go and look at a Wikipedia page because there's no manual, or you go to YouTube to figure stuff out, and so he was learning all that stuff. But then at a certain point, you know, the play patterns kind of break down, and he's just doing kind of shooter games with his friends inside there. So you know, I have to keep pushing him, and I think that there's a lot of online resources there, and you know, just try and find the thing that's appropriate for your kid. I think the courses you can find are usually pretty good as well. Another thing to check out is code.org. So code.org is a non-profit that they don't make software or curriculum themselves. And so, but they have a ton of, you know, links to stuff. They are actually trying to do something in December where, you know, they want 10 million kids to do an hour's coding. And it doesn't necessarily need to be hands-on, but they're trying to do a big thing around awareness. So someone's asking me about, have I considered making games for Steam by Valve? So have I considered that? No, not personally. I mean, it's not. I mean, there's a healthy indie scene, and a lot of my peers have gone on to do things in the indie scene, and it's a good way to go. And one of my best friends from EA in Montreal is a guy called Vander Caballero, who set up a company called Minority Inc., and he's doing some amazing things. They did a game called Papo and Yao, which was for Sony, and that's on Steam. So it's, you know, it's in many ways it's more accessible than it ever has been. But I think there's a challenge going from things like Scratch and Kodu and Stencil. Like, how do you go from that to Unity or Unreal, right? And it's quite a big jump. I guess something else I would say is, like, you know, take that modding approach, right? So whatever tool that you're doing, there will be or you know, whatever thing that you find, that there will be tutorials around it, and you'll be able to download things that other people have done, and just encourage your kids, or if you're a kid, you know, experiment yourself and keep pushing it. You know, it's okay, you can break it and you can just re-download it again. It doesn't matter. And you're going to learn a ton through that, and you're going to learn a lot through the communities and being involved in those communities. Vanessa, can I say more about how I contacted game companies when I was a teen and how I got my first jobs? So I literally called them up. You know, I just got their numbers from the Yellow Pages or what we had back then. And I called up and I said, you know, and I knew the names of the programmers, and I would say, can I speak to this guy? And so that's a little bit harder now, but probably not as hard as you think. I mean, you can, you know, maybe it's harder to just cold call people, but, you know, and this is where I think about in terms of what we could do collectively as a community, is that, you know, I know many of these people, and I think people in the video game world are very, you know, they're very busy, but they do care about technology, and they care about the next generation of technology. And I think they don't know necessarily how to help and how best to influence. But, you know, I've done things before, like when we did Kodu, we had someone who made a soccer pitch, and I called up the guys at FIFA and I said, hey, let's send him a FIFA because he loves it. So someone says, I hear it's very hard to get an indie game onto the Xbox Live. Have you ever had the experience in those situations, from Tucker? So So Tucker, that's about to change. So Xbox is a closed system, and to talk about it from a business perspective, what Microsoft has done is they lose money on their box, so they need to make money on the software. And so by keeping it a closed system, they keep up demand and they keep prices up. Um, so so they were trying to limit this for as long as they could. I mean, and it used to be, or I guess it still currently is, but they're planning to change it. But if you wanted to have an indie game done on Xbox Live, you would have to go to a publisher who already has a publishing agreement, and they would have so many slots. And there was kind of like a market. So Microsoft is Microsoft is trying to change that because they're trying to change their image, and they're in a tough position. I see Chase saying Microsoft is all about nicking and diming you. So in some ways that's right, because there's a culture in Microsoft where it's all about well, how much bottom line did we make, and they, that's how they measure people, right? And it's kind of cold like that. But the other side of it is that they're trying to build a good ecosystem, and the ecosystem of traditional games has actually eroded over the last 5 to 10 years. And this, what it used to be that you could make a game like Dead Space that was 10 hours long, and you could try a new IP, and you could have a moderate success, and you could build from that. And what's happened with the used sales market is that, a game that only lasts for 10 hours, even if it's a good game, people will trade it back in, and you walk into GameStop, and you pick up the new version of Dead Space, and they say, hey, why spend $60 on that? You can have this for $40. And that money doesn't go back into the ecosystem. And there was actually stats that I was aware of where you would see games that would go resold 6 or 7 times. So I don't think Microsoft has been totally evil in the way that they've approached that. So someone says, are you finding that companies are starting to look for big picture thinking using the knowledge of current studios on the dyslexia advantage? In other words, do they get it? I think it's a mixed bag, right? So I think I am good at all this kind of big picture thinking stuff. I'm reading the Dyslexic Advantage book now, and I'm up to the I, so I am big on the I. So it depends on the company, and I think that I've found being dyslexic, it takes me a while to learn whatever, right? It just takes me longer sometimes to learn a company. So what I've found is companies may say they want this type of person, but they've really got their inherent DNA. And so I don't know. I don't know for the big companies. I think for the smaller companies, they will do that. I mean, they have their different cultures, right? And so it's a matter of finding something that really fits you. Say more about how you contact the game company. That one. Other game making. What does background knowledge mean? Okay, so background knowledge is a couple of things around that. So background knowledge means what prior exposure does a student have? What prior knowledge do they have when they encounter it in school? And there's a couple of theories that think that this is really important. And there's one on the cognitive level that is that we just take repetition to be able to understand stuff, right? So if you've been exposed to something before you hit it in school, you're more likely to be successful at that. And then there's the social emotional, which I spoke about a little bit before, which says that if you believe you're going to be successful, there's tons of studies that that one of the biggest determinations of whether a child will be successful in a class is whether their self-assessment is that they will be successful at that class. And then as they dug into that, the background knowledge, so have they been exposed to it, matters a great deal. And so this to me affects how you think about education or how you think about learning, right? So my kids are in elementary school, and we're trying to think what should we do about coding in elementary school, and the background knowledge model says that, well, we don't necessarily need to teach them to code. What really matters is that, when they get that opportunity in middle school or high school, that they feel they will be successful. So how do we make it so that, that both boys, but in particular girls, feel like, hey, this is something for me and this is something that I will be able to do? What do you do to seed ideas to video game makers? So Henry's asking, like, I guess it's how do you pitch your ideas to video game makers? It's I would say most video game makers have a lot of ideas that they're never going to get to themselves. So it's very rare that someone will say, hey, here's a great idea, and they will take it. I think like you want to put that energy into finding people that you can make games to, right? So I think maybe I'll rephrase that. The best thing you can do to get your game made is to make the game or make a version of that game that is simple. So asking, do you think it's hard to get jobs in the video game industry without a college degree or good grades? How much do these matter? So they matter a lot more than they did when I was young. So I left school at 15. I have no college degrees or anything. So here's the thing about college degrees and why those matter. And if you're looking at, if you're hiring blind, it's just you will be more successful. Statistically, you will be, if you have to hire 100 people, you will be more successful if you hire 100 people. If you put the entry level to say, hey, you have to have a college degree, right? And it's just a statistical thing. Well, those people have had to go through those hoops. Therefore, they're more likely to have the skills that you'll need for the job. So people look for that as a baseline, and they talk about that as a baseline. But I don't think I think what really matters if you want to do this for your career is like, go make stuff, right? It doesn't matter. You could have the guy who's got the best degree. If his code, if he's got nothing to show and you've got nothing, you're going to get the job. Because guess what? Like, I am here, I got hired in the US at a time when unemployment was approaching up to 10%. And they had to do this crazy visa to get me in because the H-1Bs were all gone. And I shouldn't be here, right? This should have gone to Americans because the education system should have filled this job. But I was able to do that because of the experience that I've got. So I think even if I think you should go to college if you can, and I just think it matters. With my son, I'm like, I want him to go to college, but I want him to be making games, and he's doing that right now. How do you find music for your games? How could a composer get into games? I think that's a great question. So people, people need musicians, right? So there's two ways. It's either like you've got friends who are in games, or you hang out on the forums, or you're doing something else, right? And then, but you do a bit of game design and you do music. So it's all about trying to be in that environment of being around other game makers. Is there any colleges that you recommend? Someone spoke about DigiPen before. I think DigiPen is certainly well respected. Funnily enough, I know the ones in Montreal better. Like Montreal, I think's really got it down because they've had 10 years of Ubisoft being successful there. So what I found was you had kids like you guys who've grown up playing video games thinking, hey, I want to do that, and you see Ubisoft in town, and they say, okay, here's all the universities that feed that, here's all the courses. I guess any of the bigger universities, and I guess this is maybe something that we can try and find a good list of. So, John, is it better for games to have a compelling environment in the game that makes you feel like you're in that point of time? Or is it better to have a game that gives you a lot of information? I think it's more important that you feel it, right? I think you've got to get that emotion right. So we have no trouble giving information, right? We can just throw a textbook at someone, and we just know that that's not a fun way to learn. And I think the role of entertainment is to kind of inspire and catch our imagination. And again, Assassin's Creed did this really well because you would be there, you'd be next to Leonardo da Vinci, and you maybe heard his name before, right? And you would be having this character plot with him. But then you would have these extra things that you could go and find out about, right? So you could read up on the buildings, you could read up on the art, you could read up on the people. So I actually think it's more important for the for entertainment to kind of sell the mood of it, and then get people excited, and they'll find the information. So Don has said, I know you're onto something with using V-games as a model to motivate learning. Multisensory computer interface starting to catch on with the health industry. Are the games people paying attention? And I think they are. I just, it's tough to make all the numbers work, and education has all its extra challenges. Part of the issue with games, I think, in technology is that it's not natural for a lot of teachers to use technology. They have so many demands on them already. So this is the thing, I'm involved with my kids' elementary school, and we do things where we do things slowly, right? So we brought in iPads, and we brought in carts, and now one of the classes is one of the years, the first year said, hey, we want to do one-to-one, so we're going to do a pilot with first grade doing one-to-ones, and we want to do code, and so we're thinking, how can we get a teacher to do it, maybe as an after-school program, and we'll set them up so they can see it working for them and feel like it can work, and then transfer it over. So Trish is saying, what are some good learning games? It depends on what we're trying to learn. I mean, there's some great things out there. There is, like, Minecraft is good, I think, for the younger kids. They learn a ton about systems and logical thinking. And I think there are, Civilization is really good. There is, if you look up this, it's a site, it's called Playful Learning. I won't get it right, but if you look up if you do a search for that, so Playful Learning LGN, which is the Learning Games Network, they have a website that they've built, which is trying to catalog all the different games and what their strengths are. Yes, Dragon Box for math is good. Is there a game to teach coding to dyslexics out there? Not that I know of, but if we have someone who would want to fund me to do that, I would love to make it. That would be great. Okay, Kim's saying, I would love to see our 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades develop a learning game for the primary kids kindergarten. Art class would develop graphics, music class would develop audio, and the school would need tech advisors. We have smart boards for Skyping, etc. Just dreaming. So I think I think that's great. We're trying to figure those things out. I would look at the I think I put this in before, but code.org, and they have this thing around just get everyone coding for a day, and I think if you can get that in your school, it's a step, right? And then Chase is saying, I challenge you to make it, and I guess that's to make the coding game for dyslexics. I'm not, maybe we need that. Maybe it's just a case of having somewhere where we can all, having a forum, right, where we can continue this conversation. I think that would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. We can give you our room whenever you want to do that.
So, I'm serious. If we want to set up a forum or something like that, I would love to support that.
Yeah, no, totally. We should talk more about this, but we definitely have a lot of time where we could and resources to make things happen. So we'd be delighted. We've noticed that there are a lot of talent with programming, but it's unconventional programming. Actually, a member of our board was telling us about how when he was in programming class in college, it was blinded, so the teacher couldn't see who actually did things, but they always knew when he's dyslexic. They could always tell his coding because it was so very different from everybody else. So I think it's a fantastic idea. And if you hadn't discovered that you're really good at that, you might have never known, and look, you're just phenomenally successful. So I think it's a really cool idea. We should definitely think about that. Thank you so much, Joe. This has been fabulous. We really appreciate it. Just really loved hearing everything you're talking about.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.